Peace is not a word I hear very often these days. The situation in Ukraine has been added to a litany of continuous suffering, and the world's attention seems jaded by the multiple crises that we face. I feel for the Ukrainians who have a right to peace and who deserve peace in line with the UN Charter and international law. Instead, I fear that protracted and entrenched conflict will impact lives and human rights for generations to come. This documentation continues to indicate gross violations of international human rights law, serious violations of international humanitarian law, and war crimes, primarily by the forces of the Russian Federation. They include 142 cases of summary execution of civilians since February 2022 in territory controlled by Russian armed forces or occupied by the Russian Federation. On occupied territory, we have documented widespread torture and ill treatment of detainees, including sexual violence, as well as large numbers of forced disappearances. In addition, there has been extensive failure by the Russian Federation to take adequate measures to protect civilians and protected civilian objects against the effects of their attacks. As of 4 December, my office has recorded and confirmed over 10,000 civilian deaths resulting from the conflict since February 2022, including more than 560 children. A further 18,500 civilians have been confirmed injured, many of them severely. The true toll is probably substantially higher. Most of these civilians were killed in areas of Donetsk, Kharkiv, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, near the front lines of combat, and among them was a disproportionate number of older people unwilling or unable to relocate to greater safety. Russian missile attacks have also targeted grain storage and transport facilities, which are necessary for the export of food and constitute protected civilian objects under international humanitarian law. In territories occupied by the Russian Federation, including Crimea, we have documented patterns of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance by Russian armed forces of local officials, journalists, civil society activists, and other civilians. They include numerous Crimean Tatar activists. In the view of my office, many of these individuals were convicted for conduct that could be lawful, including, for example, work to ensure the continued functioning of social services and schools in occupied areas. I urge the Ukrainian authorities to narrow its definition of collaboration to avoid any conflict with activity that is lawful under international humanitarian law. I also continue to be deeply concerned about potential safety threats at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, one of the largest nuclear facilities in Europe, which continues to be occupied by Russian forces. The continued use of heavy weapons in close proximity to the site and fears about mismanagement of its complex systems could result in catastrophic harm to human rights. I urge all states, especially those with influence, to call for immediate and decisive measures by both parties, and in particular by the Russian Federation, to ensure that their personnel fully comply with international human rights and international humanitarian law. The targeting of civilian infrastructure, including facilities related to grain production and export, and the practices of arbitrary detention and torture must cease immediately. Ukraine must align the law on collaboration activities with international law and refrain from prosecuting individuals for collaboration when their cooperation with the occupying authorities fell within international humanitarian law. It must ensure that legislation protects freedom of religion and does not discriminate against any religious community. I also urge the swift adoption of a national strategy for the protection of civilians. I further urge both the Russian Federation and Ukraine to do everything in their power to ensure the safety and security of the operations at Ukraine's nuclear power plants.